let's talk about robbery now. So robbery is stealing from somebody by force or threats of force. And so those threats of force, the point is to induce fear in the person. So there is contact between victim and offender, which is the primary reason why this is considered a violent crime. Robbery is not a property crime. I will say that again. Robbery is not a property crime. Just because the point or the sort of motivation of robbery is to steal doesn't mean that it's a property crime. Because you have that contact between victim and offender, it's stealing by force or by inducing fear in the victim. This is a violent crime. And so because it's a violent crime, the severity of punishment is based on the amount of force used. It's not the value of the stolen property. So when you are charged with, if somebody is charged with theft or something like that, it's about, well, how much was stolen? Robbery, that is not the case. It is based on the amount of force used, whether there was a weapon involved, things like that. That's the important part because it is a violent crime. So the rate is about 400,000 a year, which equates to about 140 per 100,000 people in the U.S. This is down almost 40% in the past decade. So just like everything else, just like all violent crime and crime in general, it's going down, which is of course great, but still a pretty big problem. So there are different types of robbers. There are robberies in open areas, so things like street muggings, that would be a robbery. There are commercial robberies, like holding up a bank, that's a commercial robbery. There are robberies in private places, so like a home invasion when the owners are present. There are robberies of someone known, either briefly, like picking up somebody in a bar, or over a longer period, like robbing a girlfriend. Yeah, that happens. And carjacking. So all of these are examples of different types of robbery. So then when we look at, well, the different types of robbers, so who are the people that are doing this? And so there are some different types. So the first one is a professional robber. So a professional robber, for this person, robberies are their livelihood. They usually commit commercial robberies because you get more take and there's less risk. Very well planned out crimes. Often they work in groups. So people who rob banks and things like that. So that it is basically their job. And so they take the time to do it as well as they can. Then you have opportunist robbers. And so an opportunist would be an unplanned crime. So they steal much smaller amounts compared to the professionals. They choose vulnerable targets as opposed to lucrative targets. And so they'd be choosing people like the elderly or drunks, things like that. So it's all about opportunity. And so the Hamburglar would actually be an opportunist robber. He is not a burglar at all. He is a robber because he steals the burgers from people. So he's a violent offender, in case you wanted to know. Then you have your addict robber. This is people who steal to get money for their next fix, essentially. So they are addicted, they're a drug addict, and they steal to get money for that next fix. It's all about supporting their drug habit. They plan more than the opportunist, but not nearly as much as the professional robbers. They get increasingly careless as they get desperate for their next fix, though. And then you have your alcoholic robber, which is kind of similar, but they're either robbing while intoxicated, especially to get money for more alcohol, or when their alcoholism makes them unable to hold down a job and they need money. Very unlikely to plan, giving little thought to victim, situation, or escape, most likely to get caught, especially if they're doing it while they're intoxicated. So then you also have the acquaintance robbery that happens. And this is where you have people literally robbing people that they know. And this is interesting because there's going to be, the victims tend to be reluctant to report because they don't want to be seen as a rat, or they don't want to get somebody they know in trouble, or maybe they'll deal with it themselves. Also, it serves street justice. And so it might be that, well, I'm not going to report because I'm going to just do it myself, take care of it myself. Or it'd be that person was wronged and they are doing it in order to serve their own justice as opposed to bringing in police or anything else. There tends to be more injury than stranger robbery, suggesting that revenge might often be the motive. But also there's bigger payouts because typically they know the victim has a good take. They know that they just got, some influx of money or goods or whatever. And so typically then that suggests that the offender knew the victim had a lot of money or something expensive either on them or they just got. And so that might be part of the reason that people do this. But also, those in close proximity may just be easier. If somebody's an opportunist, it might just be easier to rob somebody that you know. And so, especially if you know they have something good on them. So then, briefly, let's talk about hate crimes as well. This could be a huge topic, so I'm only going to go over it briefly, but there's a lot that can be covered in this. In fact, in my homicide seminar, we had an entire chapter just dedicated to hate homicides. So there's a lot that could be discussed here. So, but just in general, any hate crimes are basically any prejudice-motivated crime. So the victim is targeted because of membership in a particular group. And so the most common, of course, is race, unfortunately, but that's probably what you think of when you think of hate crimes, is race-motivated, and that's because they're the most common. But religion is the next most common, and but then there's also a lot based on sexual orientation, ethnicity, disability, gender, age. So there's a lot that somebody can be prejudiced, and sort of the reason that can motivate a crime. But basically any crime that's motivated by hatred for something about the victim, and so some group membership that inspires hate in the offender. So when we look at sort of how often this happens and what it looks like, according to FBI statistics, there's about 7,000 incidents a year, but that's reported incidents. So of course there's a lot of incidents that go unreported, either because the victim is fearful or they don't want to cause any more trouble, or they just don't think it's a big enough deal. But and then of course there's a lot of incidents that actually are hate crimes. They are reported, but they aren't designated as hate crimes because the officers dealing with it or anybody in the legal system who's putting forward charges, or somebody at some point has decided that it's not a hate crime. So, and it doesn't necessarily mean for any bad reason. It's just there's not enough evidence for that or whatever. But so it's the numbers that we have. That number is not a real indicator as to how often hate crimes actually happen. Just sort of keep that in mind. But intimidation is the most common form. Just like any crime, really, the less severe are happening more often, which is good. But that means that intimidation is typically what you see most often. But about 20% involve assaults with a weapon, and some, of course, lead to death, especially in some of the cases that led to legislative change. So often it's about... It's sort of before we get into control. It's the person sometimes wants to send a message, and it's sometimes about and that's why intimidation is one of the most common forms. It's about, I don't want you to live in my neighborhood, or I don't want you to come to my school, or I don't want you to come into the restaurant that I go to. And so it's about intimidating those people and inspiring fear so that they leave, or you're sending some kind of a message. And sometimes it's to specific people like that, but sometimes the offender is sending a more wide message about how, in general, in this country we need racial purity or something. And if that's the message, it's going to be much larger, large-scale crimes that they're committing, and that's where you might come into situations of like mass murder and like the guy that drove into the Jewish synagogue and killed like 7 people, I think. So there's like situations like that, and so hate crimes can range from something as something like intimidation, all the way up to mass homicide, and of course everything in between. So how these have been controlled then, legislation has been designed to combat hate crimes in particular, and of course we know that any crime that is designated as a hate crime, it carries an additional sanction, an additional punishment. So if 2 people do objectively the same thing in the sense that, they both kill somebody, let's say, or they both beat somebody up. But one person did it out of hatred, and so it's designated as a hate crime. Even if they did objectively the same thing, the person that has committed the hate crime is going to have a larger sentence, because it's about deterring that kind of behavior and things like that. So there was some people that sort of tried to say, well, you can't tell me I can't do this. It's it's an infringement of my constitutional right to freedom of speech and freedom of expression and whatnot. To have like symbolic acts of hate, so things like burning crosses and drawing swastikas, things like that. It was legally upheld that you cannot use and sort of express yourself in that way. It does not violate constitutional right to freedom of speech or freedom of expression, because it is viewed as evidence of an intent to intimidate somebody. So because you're trying to intimidate a person or a group by using those symbols, it is not just your freedom of speech or your freedom of expression. It is, you are intimidating somebody else. So that ban of these symbolic acts of hatred, that was legally upheld, and that was the reason. So a very brief overview of hate crimes, but sort of just something to maybe inspire you to go and seek out some more of this stuff. And it's terrible things that have happened in the name of hatred, of course, but some interesting cases and interesting legislation that has come from it as well.